A crowded restaurant, a carefully planned deception, and a young woman who had no idea she was about to shatter every assumption a wealthy man had about love. Marcus Chun thought he had people figured out. After 3 failed relationships where women mysteriously disappeared the moment his bank account stopped being the main attraction, he'd devised what he believed was the perfect test. He would bring his wheelchair-bound brother Daniel to every first date, watching from the shadows as potential partners revealed their true character. What Marcus didn't expect was to meet someone who would see Daniel not as an obstacle to overcome, or a burden to tolerate, but as a person worth knowing. And what he especially didn't expect was that this revelation would come from a part-time barista named Riley Thompson, who wore second-hand clothes and took the bus to their coffee shop meeting because she couldn't afford gas that week. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning started like any other in Marcus Chun's penthouse office on the 37th floor of the Chun Financial Tower. Floor to ceiling, windows offered a panoramic view of downtown Seattle, where the early autumn rain painted everything in shades of silver and gray. Marcus stood at those windows now, straightening his Italian silk tie while reviewing the profile on his phone. Riley Thompson, 26, psychology student at the University of Washington, works part-time at 3 different coffee shops to pay for school. Her dating profile was refreshingly honest, free of the carefully curated luxury vacation photos and designer handbag displays that cluttered most of the apps he browsed through. Her smile in the photos looked genuine, unfiltered, the kind that reached her eyes and suggested she laughed often. She'd messaged him first, something that rarely happened anymore since his wealth had become common knowledge in certain social circles. Her opening line had been simple: "Your profile says you like books more than people. I'm curious which genre makes you feel more optimistic about humanity." It wasn't flirtatious or calculated. It was thoughtful, and that alone had caught his attention. Marcus had built his fortune from nothing, transforming a small tech startup into a multinational corporation worth over $200 million. He'd learned early that success attracted people for all the wrong reasons. The women who pursued him now weren't interested in his thoughts on literature or his tendency to spend Saturday mornings reading philosophy while his coffee grew cold. They wanted access to his world of private jets and exclusive galas, of 5-star restaurants and spontaneous trips to Paris. They tolerated his personality as a necessary inconvenience to reach his wallet. The discovery of this pattern had been gradual, then sudden, like watching a crack spread across glass until the whole pane shattered. His last relationship, with a marketing executive named Bethany, had ended when he'd overheard her on the phone with a friend, describing him as boring but loaded, and discussing how long she'd need to date him before she could reasonably expect expensive gifts. The conversation lasted 23 minutes. He'd timed it, standing frozen in his own hallway while she dissected his personality like a stock portfolio, weighing his flaws against his assets. That betrayal had led to the creation of what he privately called the test. It was simple in concept, devastating in execution. Daniel, his younger brother, had been paralyzed from the waist down in a climbing accident 4 years earlier. The adjustment had been brutal for all of them, but Daniel had emerged with a perspective on life that humbled Marcus daily. He was funny, intelligent, and possessed an uncanny ability to read people's true intentions within minutes of meeting them. He was also, Marcus had discovered, the perfect litmus test for revealing character. The plan was always the same. Marcus would arrange to meet his date at a casual location, somewhere public but not too crowded. Halfway through their conversation, Daniel would appear, introduced as Marcus's brother who happened to be in the neighborhood. Then Marcus would watch. He'd observe how his date interacted with Daniel, whether they spoke to him directly or addressed Marcus as if Daniel couldn't hear. He'd notice if they seemed uncomfortable, impatient, or eager to relocate to somewhere more private. In the past 8 months, he'd conducted this test 17 times. 17 women had failed in ways that ranged from subtle dismissal to outright rudeness. One woman had suggested they move to a different restaurant because this one didn't seem accessible. Another had spent the entire interaction speaking in an unnaturally loud voice, as if Daniel's paralysis had affected his hearing. The worst had been a real estate agent named Claire who'd actually asked Daniel if he was getting better soon, and then launched into a detailed description of an accessible apartment complex she was trying to sell, treating him like a potential client rather than a person. Each failure had hardened something inside Marcus, confirming his growing suspicion that genuine connection was impossible at his level of wealth. People saw the money first, the person second, and everyone else not at all. Daniel had stopped asking why these promising relationships always seemed to end after the first meeting. He knew about the test, had reluctantly agreed to participate, but Marcus could see the toll it was taking on him. Each false interaction was a reminder that many people struggled to see past his wheelchair to the brilliant mind and generous heart beneath. But Riley Thompson was different, at least on paper. Her messages revealed someone who asked questions instead of making assumptions, who seemed more interested in his thoughts than his net worth. She'd suggested they meet at Grind Coffee, a small independent shop near the university campus rather than one of the upscale establishments he usually frequented. When he'd offered to pick a more expensive location, she'd politely declined, explaining that she preferred places where the coffee was strong and the atmosphere was comfortable rather than impressive. Marcus had done his research. Of course. Riley Thompson lived in a studio apartment in the Capitol Hill neighborhood, split rent with a roommate, and had been working her way through graduate school for the past 3 years. Her social media profile showed someone who hiked local trails on weekends, volunteered at a literacy program for adults, and seemed to find joy in small things like farmers market flowers and library book sales. There were no photos of expensive meals or luxury brands, no carefully staged shots designed to attract wealthy suitors. Instead, he found pictures of sunsets, coffee art, and candid moments with friends who looked genuinely happy to be in her company. The cynical part of him wondered if this was an elaborate long game, a more sophisticated approach to the same goal. Perhaps she'd researched him as thoroughly as he'd researched her, crafting a persona designed to appeal to his apparent preference for authenticity over glamour. But something about her messages suggested otherwise. They were too natural, too unguarded, filled with the kind of random observations and gentle humor that was difficult to fake consistently. Daniel had been skeptical when Marcus explained the plan for this particular test. Maybe, Daniel had suggested from his position at the kitchen island where he was grading papers from his job as a substitute teacher, you should consider the possibility that the test itself is the problem. You're starting every potential relationship with deception. How do you expect to build something real on that foundation? The question had stung because it contained truth Marcus wasn't ready to examine. But he'd convinced himself that the ends justified the means. Better to discover someone's true character early than to invest months in a relationship built on false pretenses. Better to protect both his heart and his brother's dignity than to hope for the best and be disappointed again. The rain had intensified while he'd been lost in thought, turning the city below into an impressionist painting of blurred lights and movement. Marcus checked his watch. In 2 hours he would walk into Grind Coffee and find out whether Riley Thompson was everything her messages suggested, or whether she was simply better at hiding her true motivations than the others had been. Either way, Daniel would be joining them, arriving precisely 30 minutes into their conversation with a carefully rehearsed story about being in the neighborhood. Marcus gathered his coat and briefcase, pausing at the office door to look back at the empire he'd built. The awards lining his shelves, the photographs with politicians and celebrities, The framed articles chronicling his rise from scholarship student to billionaire entrepreneur. All of it felt hollow lately, like a museum dedicated to someone else's life. Success had isolated him in ways he hadn't anticipated, surrounding him with people who wanted something from him rather than people who simply wanted to know him. The elevator ride to the parking garage gave him time to review his strategy. One more time. He would be charming but not overwhelming, interested but not eager. He would ask questions about her studies, her work, her dreams for the future. He would listen carefully to her answers, searching for signs of calculation or rehearsal. And when Daniel arrived, he would watch her face in that crucial first moment when surprise gave way to reaction. That moment, he'd learned, revealed everything. His Tesla Model S waited in its reserved spot, gleaming silver under the fluorescent lights. The drive to Capitol Hill would take 25 minutes in current traffic, giving him time to settle into the role he'd perfected over months of practice. Marcus Chun, successful but not ostentatious, interested in genuine connection but guarded about his wealth. It was partially true, which made it easier to maintain consistently as he navigated the rain-slicked streets toward the University District. Marcus found himself hoping, despite his cynicism, that Riley Thompson would surprise him. Not because he needed another relationship to fail, but because he was tired of being right about people's worst impulses. He was tired of watching Daniel interact with people who saw his wheelchair before they saw his smile. He was tired of dating women who treated kindness like a currency to be exchanged for access to luxury. Maybe, he thought as he pulled into a parking space 3 blocks from Grind Coffee, this time would be different. Maybe Riley Thompson would see Daniel as a person worth knowing rather than an obstacle to navigate. Maybe she would ask genuine questions instead of offering false sympathy. Maybe she would treat him with the respect and dignity that came naturally to people with good hearts. The rain had softened to a drizzle by the time Marcus locked his car and began walking toward what might be his 18th disappointment or his first real chance at something authentic. Either way, he would have his answer within the hour. Either way, the test would reveal the truth, just as it always had before. Grind Coffee occupied the corner of a brick building that had probably housed a dozen different businesses over the decades. The interior was exactly what Marcus had expected. From Riley's description, mismatched furniture that somehow worked together, local artwork covering every available wall space, and the rich aroma of freshly roasted beans that made the expensive coffee shops downtown seem sterile by comparison. A chalkboard menu hung behind the counter, written in cheerful script that advertised seasonal drinks with names like Autumn Whisper and Rainy Day Revival. Marcus arrived 15 minutes early, a habit that served him well in business negotiations, but felt awkward in social situations. He ordered a simple black coffee from a barista with purple hair and multiple ear piercings who recommended the house blend with genuine enthusiasm. The coffee was excellent, far better than what he usually drank from his office's expensive espresso machine. He found a table near the window where he could watch the street, while maintaining a clear view of the entrance. The rain had stopped completely, leaving the sidewalks mirror bright and reflecting the warm light spilling from shop windows. Students hurried past with backpacks and coffee cups. Couples walked hand in hand under the protection of shared umbrellas, and elderly residents of the neighborhood moved at their own unhurried pace. It was a slice of normal life that Marcus rarely observed anymore, insulated as he was by wealth and the demands of running a multinational corporation. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Riley Thompson walked through the door at exactly 3 o'clock, and Marcus felt his carefully prepared composure shift unexpectedly. Her photos hadn't captured the way she moved through space, confident but not aggressive, aware of her surroundings, without seeming nervous. She wore dark jeans with holes at the knees that looked earned rather than purchased, a forest green sweater that brought out the color of her eyes, and canvas sneakers that had clearly seen many miles of walking. Her brown hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and she carried a messenger bag that was covered in patches from various national parks. She spotted him immediately, offering a smile that transformed her entire face and made Marcus forget whatever opening line he'd rehearsed during the drive over. "Marcus?" she asked, approaching his table with an easy confidence that suggested she was genuinely happy to be there, rather than nervously hopeful about impressing him. "Riley, thank you for meeting me." He stood to shake her hand, noting that her grip was firm and her palms weren't sweaty, despite what must have been first-date nerves. "Can I get you something to drink?" "Actually, I'll grab it myself if that's okay. I have a complicated relationship with caffeine that requires direct communication with whoever's making my order," she grinned apologetically. "College student. Problems, I'll be right back." Marcus watched her approach the counter, observing how she interacted with the purple-haired barista. There was no condescension in her manner, no sense that she considered herself above the job of making coffee. Instead, she asked about the barista's recommendation for something adventurous but not terrifying, and laughed at whatever joke was shared in response. When she returned to the table with a large mug topped with elaborate foam art, she was still smiling. "Maple cinnamon latte with oat milk," she announced, settling into her chair and immediately wrapping her hands around the warm ceramic. "Claire over there promised it would change my life, though I suspect that might be overselling it slightly. How many life-changing experiences have you had in coffee shops?" Marcus asked, surprising himself with how natural the conversation felt. "More than you'd expect, actually. I wrote my undergraduate thesis in a place like this in Portland. Spent so many hours there that the owner eventually just let me plug in my laptop permanently and started bringing me free refills." Riley took a careful sip of her latte and made an appreciative sound. "Okay, Claire might not have been exaggerating. This is extraordinary." They fell into conversation with an ease that Marcus hadn't experienced in years. Riley asked about his work without immediately following up with questions about his salary or company valuation. When he mentioned traveling for business, she wanted to know which cities had surprised him rather than which hotels were the most luxurious. She talked about her graduate program with passion, explaining her research into trauma therapy with children in foster care with the kind of enthusiasm that suggested she'd found her calling rather than simply chosen a career path. "The thing that breaks my heart," Riley said, leaning forward slightly as she spoke, "is how many of these kids have learned to expect disappointment. They've been let down so many times that they approach every new situation assuming it won't work out. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy because they can't risk hoping for better." Marcus felt something twist uncomfortably in his chest. The description hit closer to home than Riley could know, resonating with his own growing cynicism about relationships and his assumption that people would ultimately disappoint him. How do you break through that kind of protective barrier? Patience, mostly, and consistency. You have to prove over time that you're not going anywhere, that your interest in their well-being isn't conditional or temporary. Rayleigh's expression grew thoughtful. "Some of the most meaningful relationships I've seen develop started with the smallest gestures. Someone remembering a child's favorite color, or asking about their drawings week after week, even when the kid barely responds at first." The conversation continued to flow naturally through topics both serious and lighthearted. Riley had strong opinions about everything from local politics to the best hiking trails in the Cascade Mountains. She was well-read but not pretentious, funny without being performative, and possessed the kind of genuine curiosity about the world that Marcus had almost forgotten existed. When she asked him questions, she listened to his answers with attention that felt both flattering and slightly unnerving. As the minutes passed, Marcus found himself forgetting about the test entirely. Riley's presence was compelling enough to pushed thoughts of Daniel and careful observation to the back of his mind. She had stories about her students from the literacy program, amusing anecdotes from her various coffee shop jobs, and a way of finding humor in everyday frustrations that made even mundane experiences sound interesting. "I have to ask," Riley said during a brief lull in conversation, "what made you suggest meeting here instead of somewhere more?" She gestured vaguely toward the window, in the direction of downtown's upscale districts. Marcus paused, realizing this was exactly the kind of question he'd prepared for. "I spend most of my day in places that prioritize image over substance. Sometimes it's refreshing to be somewhere that cares more about the quality of the coffee than the thread count of the tablecloths." "That's a very diplomatic way of saying most fancy places are pretentious," Riley said with a laugh. "I appreciate the honesty, and for what it's worth, I think you made the right choice. This place has character, even if the chairs are a little wobbly," she demonstrated by shifting slightly in her seat, causing the mismatched wooden chair to creak in protest. Marcus found himself laughing, a genuine sound that surprised him with its spontaneity. When was the last time someone had made him laugh without trying too hard or crafting their humor specifically to impress him? They were 45 minutes into their conversation when Marcus's phone buzzed with a text message. "Daniel, right on. Schedule, running a few minutes late, but I'll be there soon. Everything going according to plan?" Marcus glanced at the message and felt his stomach tighten. In 15 minutes, Daniel would walk through the door and the real test would begin. Everything that had happened so far, all the easy conversation and genuine connection, would be overshadowed by Riley's reaction to his brother's disability. Everything. "Okay?" Riley asked, noticing his change in expression. "Yes, actually my brother might stop by. He's in the neighborhood and mentioned wanting to meet you." Marcus delivered the lie smoothly, watching Riley's face for any sign of annoyance or calculation. Instead, her expression brightened with what appeared to be genuine interest. "That's wonderful. I'd love to meet him. Is he older or younger?" "Younger by 3 years. He's a teacher, substitute work mostly, but he's passionate about education." Marcus found himself sharing more truth than he'd intended, drawn by Riley's apparent enthusiasm. "A teacher and a businessman. Your parents must be proud of how differently talented their sons turned out." Riley's comment contained no judgment, just observation delivered with warmth. Marcus nodded, feeling the familiar mixture of pride and protectiveness that always accompanied thoughts of Daniel. His brother had rebuilt his life with remarkable resilience after the accident, refusing to let his disability define his possibilities. But Marcus had also witnessed how quickly people's attitudes could shift when they realized Daniel's limitations, how conversations became stilted and awkward once the wheelchair entered the picture. "He's actually the more accomplished of the two of us," Marcus said, meaning it completely. "I just happen to get lucky with timing and technology. Daniel makes a real difference in people's lives every day." Riley tilted her head slightly, studying his expression. "You're really close with him, aren't you?" "That's rare with siblings sometimes, especially with that age gap." "We became closer after." Marcus paused, realizing he was about to reveal more than he'd planned. "After some difficult circumstances a few years ago. Sometimes it takes adversity to show you what really matters." "I understand that completely. My relationship with my younger sister changed dramatically when our parents divorced. Suddenly, we were the constants in each other's lives when everything else felt unstable." Riley's voice carried a note of shared experience that made Marcus wonder what other challenges she'd navigated with grace. The conversation was interrupted by the gentle chime of the coffee shop's door opening. Marcus looked up to see Daniel maneuvering his wheelchair through the entrance with practiced efficiency, scanning the room until he spotted their table. This was the moment Marcus had orchestrated 17 times before, the crucial test that would reveal Riley's true character. Daniel approached with a smile that reached his eyes, the same warm expression that had charmed teachers and students. Throughout his career, he wore a navy blue button-down shirt and khaki pants, professional but approachable, and moved with the confidence of someone who had long ago stopped apologizing for taking up space in the world. Marcus watched Riley's face as Daniel drew closer, searching for the telltale signs of discomfort, pity, or false enthusiasm that had marked every previous encounter. What he saw instead was simple curiosity and the kind of welcoming expression she might offer to any new person entering her orbit. Riley stood immediately as Daniel approached their table, not out of obligation or awkwardness, but with the same natural courtesy she would extend to anyone joining their conversation. Her movement was fluid, unconscious, the kind of instinctive politeness that came from genuine respect for others, rather than calculated social performance. "You must be Daniel," she said, extending her hand with a warm smile. "I'm Riley. Marcus was just telling me you're a teacher." Daniel's face lit up with surprise and pleasure. In 17 previous encounters, only 3 women had addressed him directly upon introduction, and none had done so with such immediate warmth. "Guilty as charged," he replied, shaking her hand firmly. "Though substitute teacher is more accurate. I'm still working my way up the educational food chain." "Substitute teaching is incredibly challenging," Riley said, settling back into her chair as Daniel positioned his wheelchair at their table. "You have to walk into completely unfamiliar classrooms and somehow maintain order while actually teaching something meaningful. What grades do you usually work with?" Marcus watched this exchange with growing amazement. Riley's attention was focused entirely on Daniel, her questions arising from genuine interest rather than polite obligation. There was no performative kindness in her manner, no exaggerated enthusiasm that suggested she was overcompensating for discomfort. She simply treated Daniel like a person worth getting to know. "Mostly middle school, which either makes me incredibly brave or slightly masochistic," Daniel answered with a grin. "Though I have to admit, 13-year-olds keep me on my toes in ways that college students never did." "You taught at the university level before?" Riley leaned forward slightly, the same engaged posture she'd maintained throughout her conversation with Marcus. Daniel glanced briefly at his brother, a flicker of something passing between them that Riley didn't catch. "I was working on my PhD in education when I had an accident that changed my trajectory. Sometimes life has different plans than the ones we make." "That must have been incredibly difficult to navigate," Riley said softly, without a trace of pity in her voice. "Starting over professionally while dealing with personal challenges. I can't imagine the strength that required." Marcus felt his chest tighten. This was not how these conversations usually went. Most women responded to Daniel's carefully vague reference to his accident with either uncomfortable silence or intrusive questions about his medical condition. Riley had acknowledged the difficulty without demanding details, offering sympathy without condescension. "The kids actually make it easier in some ways," Daniel continued, visibly relaxing as the conversation progressed. "They're refreshingly direct about curiosity, but they also adapt quickly once they realize I'm still the authority figure in the classroom, wheels or no wheels." Riley laughed genuinely. "I work with children in foster care, and you're absolutely right about their directness. Last week, a 7-year-old asked me why I bothered putting on lipstick if I was just going to eat it off during lunch anyway. I had no good answer." "Smart kid," Daniel said approvingly. "That's the kind of logical thinking we should be encouraging in schools." The conversation flowed naturally among the 3 of them, with Riley seamlessly including both brothers without making Daniel feel like a special accommodation or Marcus feel like a forgotten presence. She asked Daniel about his teaching philosophy, shared stories from her work with children, and discovered they had remarkably similar views on educational approaches that prioritized emotional development alongside academic achievement. Marcus found himself participating less and observing more, not because he felt excluded, but because he was witnessing something unprecedented. Daniel was animated in a way Marcus hadn't seen in months, his natural charisma and intelligence on full display. And Riley was responding to those qualities rather than focusing on his disability or treating him as inspiration for overcoming obstacles. "Can I ask you something that might be completely inappropriate?" Riley said suddenly, addressing Daniel with the same directness she'd praised in children. Daniel raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "I'm listening. Do people treat you like you're brave for doing perfectly normal things?" "Because I work with trauma survivors, and I've noticed that people sometimes confuse resilience with inspiration in ways that must be exhausting." Marcus's coffee cup stopped halfway to his mouth. In 17 tests, no one had ever asked such a perceptive question or demonstrated such understanding of the complex social dynamics Daniel navigated daily. Daniel's expression shifted to something approaching wonder. "That's exactly what happens. People act like I'm heroic for buying groceries or going to the movies, as if living my life is somehow extraordinary rather than just necessary. It must be incredibly isolating," Riley said thoughtfully. "Being constantly elevated to some kind of symbolic status instead of just being allowed to exist as yourself. You understand that remarkably well for someone who hasn't experienced it personally," Daniel said, studying her with new interest. Riley shrugged, wrapping her hands around her coffee mug. "Different circumstances, similar dynamics. Growing up poor in a wealthy school district taught me about being treated as a symbol rather than a person. People either wanted to save me or use me as evidence of their own charity, but very few actually wanted to know me." The parallel she'd drawn was so accurate, so insightful, that Marcus felt his entire worldview shifting. Riley wasn't just passing his test. She was demonstrating a level of emotional intelligence and empathy that he hadn't known how to test. Her understanding of Daniel's experience came not from textbook knowledge or calculated kindness, but from her own navigation of social prejudice and misplaced sympathy. "That's why you chose psychology," Daniel said, not really asking. "Partially. I got tired of being misunderstood and decided to make a career out of understanding others better." Riley's smile held a hint of self-deprecation. "Though I'm still working on understanding myself most days." Marcus watched his brother's face light up with recognition and connection. Daniel had spent years feeling like the world saw his wheelchair first and him second, but Riley had reversed that equation entirely. She'd seen him as an educator, a thinker, a person with valuable perspectives shaped by but not defined by his circumstances. "I have to say," Daniel continued, "it's refreshing to meet someone who gets it without me having to explain the complicated social dynamics involved." "People mean well, usually," Riley said diplomatically. "But good intentions don't always translate to comfortable interactions." "Exactly." Daniel turned to Marcus with an expression his brother couldn't quite read. "Where did you find someone this perceptive?" The question hung in the air, loaded with implications Marcus wasn't prepared to address. How could he explain that he'd found Riley through a dating app, specifically because he'd been searching for someone who would pass his secret test? How could he admit that everything about their meeting had been orchestrated to evaluate her character rather than to genuinely get to know her? "We matched online," Marcus said carefully, which was technically true but felt like a gross oversimplification of his motivations. "Online dating," Daniel mused. "The modern approach to finding connection. Though I imagine it's complicated when you're trying to determine whether someone is interested in you or your circumstances." The comment was directed at Riley, but Marcus felt it like a physical blow. Daniel had unknowingly articulated exactly the fear that had driven Marcus to create his elaborate testing system, but hearing it spoken aloud made him realize how cynical and defensive his approach had become. "I suppose that's always a risk," Riley said thoughtfully. "Though I've found that people's true motivations usually reveal themselves pretty quickly in conversation." It's hard to fake genuine interest or authentic curiosity for very long. She glanced at Marcus as she spoke, and he wondered if she'd somehow detected the undercurrents of deception in their meeting. But her expression remained open and warm, without suspicion or calculation. Marcus mentioned you work multiple jobs while finishing school, Daniel said, steering the conversation toward Riley's circumstances. That takes incredible dedication, or incredible stubbornness, Riley replied with a laugh. I'm not sure there's much difference sometimes. But I've been working since I was 14, so it feels more natural than sitting still would at this point. What drives you to keep pushing through the exhaustion? Daniel asked. Beyond just financial necessity, I mean. Riley considered the question seriously, her fingers tracing patterns on the wooden table surface. I think it's wanting to prove that where you start doesn't have to determine where you end up, not just to other people, but to myself. Every degree one earn, every professional milestone I reach, feels like evidence that I belong in spaces where people like me aren't usually welcome. Marcus felt another uncomfortable recognition. Riley's determination to prove her worth resonated with his own drive to build something significant from nothing, but her motivation seemed purer somehow, less tangled up with ego and the need to impress others. The conversation continued for another hour, touching on everything from educational policy to favorite books to travel dreams. Riley and Daniel discovered they both loved mystery novels, preferred hiking to beach vacations, and believed strongly in the importance of arts education in schools. Their connection was immediate and genuine, the kind of easy friendship that usually took months to develop. Throughout it all, Marcus found himself becoming a secondary character in his own carefully orchestrated test. Riley's attention was equally distributed between both brothers, but her focus on Daniel felt revolutionary in its normalcy. She didn't treat him like an inspiration or a tragedy. She treated him like Marcus's brilliant younger brother who happened to use a wheelchair to get around. As the afternoon light began to fade outside the coffee shop windows, Daniel glanced at his watch with obvious reluctance. I should probably head out. I have papers to grade for tomorrow's classes, and procrastination only makes the red pen sting worse. It was wonderful meeting you, Riley said sincerely, standing to shake his hand again. I hope we get the chance to continue this conversation sometime. I'd like that very much, Daniel replied, and Marcus could see that he meant it completely. Marcus, you picked well with this one. The comment was casual, brotherly teasing, but it hit Marcus like a spotlight illuminating his deception. Daniel had no idea that Marcus had picked Riley specifically to subject her to this test, that their entire meeting had been a performance designed to evaluate her character, rather than to genuinely connect with her. 3 weeks passed in silence. Marcus threw himself into work with desperate intensity, attending board meetings and reviewing quarterly reports with mechanical precision, while his mind replayed every moment of his conversation with Riley. The confession, her disappointment, the way she'd walked away without anger, but with something far worse, lost faith in his character. Daniel noticed the change immediately. During their usual Sunday dinner at Marcus's penthouse, he set down his fork and studied his brother with concern. You've been miserable since you met Riley, Daniel observed. What happened after I left that day? Marcus pushed food around his plate, unable to meet his brother's eyes. I told her about the test. What? Daniel's voice carried a sharp edge. Marcus had rarely heard the full confession spilled out. Then 18 women, carefully orchestrated meetings, the systematic evaluation of character through deception. Daniel listened with growing horror, his expression shifting from confusion to disappointment, to something approaching anger. You used me, Daniel said quietly when Marcus finished. You turned my disability into a tool for manipulating people. I was protecting us both, Marcus protested weakly. No, you were protecting yourself. And you made me complicit in deceiving innocent people. Daniel's wheelchair scraped against the floor as he positioned himself directly across from Marcus. Do you have any idea how that makes me feel? Knowing that every genuine connection I thought I was making was actually part of your elaborate scheme. The accusation hit Marcus like a physical blow. He'd been so focused on protecting Daniel from rejection that he'd never considered how his brother would feel about being used as an unwitting accomplice in deception. Riley was different, Marcus said desperately. She saw you immediately, treated you like a person, Daniel interrupted. The way any decent human being should. But instead of appreciating that naturally, you'd turned it into a performance she didn't know she was giving. Marcus spent the following days in a haze of regret and self-recrimination. He'd built an empire through calculated risks and strategic thinking, but his personal life had become a series of manipulations that ultimately isolated him from genuine connection. The very wealth and success that had attracted false relationships had also corrupted his ability to recognize authentic ones. On a gray Thursday morning, Marcus found himself standing outside the literacy center where Riley volunteered. He'd learned her schedule through careful research, the same investigative approach that had once felt like reasonable caution, but now felt like stalking. He waited in his car for an hour, watching her work with adult students through the window. Before finally summoning the courage to approach, Riley emerged at noon, pulling her coat tight against the autumn wind. When she saw Marcus waiting by the entrance, her expression remained carefully neutral. "Hello, Marcus. I know I don't deserve your time," he began, "but I need to apologize properly. You already apologized at the coffee shop." That wasn't an apology. That was an explanation disguised as an excuse. Marcus fell into step beside her as she walked toward the bus stop. "I want to apologize for deceiving you, for using you, for turning what should have been a genuine getting-to-know-you process into a secret evaluation." Riley stopped walking and turned to face him. "What do you want from me, Marcus?" "Nothing," he said, meaning it completely. "I want to give you something instead." From his coat pocket, he pulled out a thick envelope. "Information about the foster care program you mentioned. Funding details, contact information for philanthropists who might be interested in supporting your research. No strings attached, no expectation of forgiveness or future contact." Riley took the envelope with obvious suspicion. "Why?" "Because you're doing important work, and I have resources that could help. Because meeting you, even under false pretenses, reminded me that success should serve a purpose beyond accumulation." Marcus paused, struggling to articulate thoughts he'd never spoken aloud. "Because you deserved better from me, and this is the only way I know how to acknowledge that." "You could have just written a check," Riley pointed out. "Anyone can write a check. This requires ongoing commitment, relationship building, the kind of patient work that can't be bought with money alone." Marcus smiled sadly. "You taught me that some things require genuine investment of time and trust." Riley studied the envelope's contents, her expression softening slightly as she realized the scope of what he'd assembled. Months of research, carefully curated connections, a roadmap for expanding her program in ways she'd never imagined possible. "This is extraordinary," she said quietly. "It's what you deserve. What your work deserves." Marcus stepped back, creating physical distance that matched the emotional space between them. "I should go. I just wanted you to know that meeting you changed something in me, even if I handled it terribly." "Marcus, wait." Riley's voice stopped him mid-turn. "What you did was wrong. The deception, the testing, the manipulation, it violated trust in ways that can't easily be repaired." He nodded, accepting the judgment he knew he'd earned. But Riley continued, "The fact that you recognized it was wrong, that you told me the truth even knowing it would cost you, that suggests you're capable of growth. Does that mean anything for us?" Marcus asked carefully. Riley was quiet for a long moment, weighing possibilities against pain. It means we might be able to build something real from here. Not based on tests or deception, but on honest communication and mutual respect. I'd like that, Marcus said, more than anything. It won't be easy, Riley warned. Trust, once broken, has to be rebuilt slowly, with consistent actions rather than grand gestures. I understand. 6 months later, Marcus and Riley sat together in the newly opened Chun Foundation Learning Center, watching Daniel lead a workshop for adult literacy students. The space buzzed with energy and purpose, funded by Marcus's wealth, but shaped by Riley's vision and expertise. He's a natural teacher, Riley observed, watching Daniel encourage a nervous student through a difficult passage. He always was, Marcus agreed. I just never gave other people the chance to see it naturally. Their relationship had developed slowly, built on coffee shop conversations and volunteer work rather than expensive restaurants and luxury experiences. Riley had insisted on authentic interactions, real shared experiences that revealed character through action rather than evaluation through deception. Marcus had learned to appreciate the difference between being loved for who he was versus what he could provide. And Riley had learned that beneath the cynicism and defensive manipulation lay someone capable of genuine care and meaningful change. The test that had nearly destroyed their chance at connection had ultimately taught them both something more valuable than Marcus's original system ever could have, that real relationships required mutual vulnerability, honest communication, and the courage to trust without guarantees. As they watched Daniel's students celebrate their progress, Marcus reached for Riley's hand. She didn't pull away. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.